Hey everybody, I'd like to talk to you today about my most recent library book, The Adventures of Ibn Battuta, a Traveler in the 14th Century by Ross Dunn. This book talks about the travels of, I'm not going to remember this name all in one go. Abu Abdallah Muhammad ibn Abdallah ibn Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Lawati ibn Battuta, usually shortened to Ibn Battuta or just Battuta. Battuta is considered the most widely traveled man of his time, and often called an Arab Marco Polo, although I think that comparison does a disservice to both Battuta and Marco Polo. He was very widely traveled. Over the course of about 30 years, starting in 1325, he went from his home in Tangiers, across North Africa to Mecca, up through the Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, Anatolia, the Crimea, Central Asia, India. See, I keep forgetting my place. There's so many places. The East African coast, Malaysia, China, Mali. Did I miss any? I think that's it. I think that's finally everything. So, yeah, he went so many places. And the thing that allowed him to travel so widely is what's interesting to me. Battuta was a legal scholar from a family of legal scholars in Tangiers, and while his first trip, or the first part of his trip, was a Hajj to Mecca, it had another purpose. See, the way you studied when you were a 14th century Muslim scholar was that you traveled around to different cities and sought out teachers who would work with you on a single text, going over it until you understood it. Often this was the writer of the text or a direct student of the person who wrote the text. And any certificates of scholarly learning that you got came with a pedigree. You learned this from this person who learned it from this person, etc., however far back until the originator of the text. So Battuta, in addition to his Hajj, was stopping at some of these cities, particularly Alexandria, and arriving in the Levant with enough time to hit up Jerusalem and some other scholars in that area before needing to make his way down to Mecca. And he studied hadiths and books of legal philosophy and what have you. This was the expected modus operandi of Muslim scholars at the time. Hajj wasn't just the pilgrimage, it was an excuse to go to all of these places and do your studies. But of course, as we know from all the places he visited, Battuta took it way further than that. After his Hajj, instead of taking a caravan back home to Tangiers, Battuta went in the other direction, towards Persia. This kicks off 30 years of almost compulsive traveling. At some point, Battuta made the decision to never retread a path that he's already traveled, which explains some of the strange meandering routes that he took, particularly through Central Asia. Some of the places he went almost on a whim, like you arrive in Oman and it's the wrong season to travel to India, the winds are wrong, and so instead, let's go to the Swahili coast. I guess we're headed to Kilwa. Why not? Battuta was able to do things like that because of the way the Muslim world handled traveling scholars. He would arrive at a place and announce himself to the emir or whatever local ruler and be given lodging and gifts. Almost all of the places Battuta stayed were provided for him by local rulers, or he would stay with a scholar he was studying with. This attitude towards traveling scholars was aided quite a bit by the fact that a lot of areas around the frontiers that he was traveling through were actively trying to attract scholars. For example, the Khans of Kipchak and Chagatai had only recently converted to Islam and were trying to get as many established Muslim scholars into their courts to give them legitimacy. Many of the rulers who welcomed Battuta also employed him in his capacity as a legal scholar. He essentially worked as the 14th century equivalent of a lawyer in most of the places he traveled through. But this focus on scholarly pursuits comes at a bit of a detriment. Battuta was an upper-class Muslim traveling amongst upper-class Muslims and writing for upper-class Muslims, particularly other scholars. So we don't see a lot of descriptions of local non-Muslim populations, for example, the Hindu majority in the Delhi Sultanate, nor do we get a real picture of what everyday life was like for just normal people living in the areas he traveled through, even in the Muslim majority areas. While historians and anthropologists would be super interested to have those notes, those things just weren't on Battuta's mind as he was traveling. But the most important reason that Battuta was able to travel so widely, at least to me, isn't from the fact that he was a scholar, but in the routes he took. Unlike Marco Polo, who was traveling in areas largely unknown to him and his contemporaries in Europe, Battuta was traveling through what is known as the Dar al-Islam. He was traveling from place to place on Hajj caravans and alongside Muslim merchants. This was a trip that anyone in his social class could have taken if they put their minds to it. And these weren't exotic foreign places. These were fairly culturally similar communities of Muslims living all across these spaces. The only time Battuta ever got any real culture shock were in places where conversion to Islam was fairly recent, as in the courts of the Central Asian Khans, or in places where there was heavy syncretism between Islam and prior local customs, such as in Mali. Dunn also credits the ease of Battuta's travels to something known as the Pax Mongolica. Essentially, the Mongol invasion was over, and the successor states had taken up the task of rebuilding everything that Genghis had razed to the ground. And so Dunn points to this period of time where Battuta was traveling as a moment of unique stability across the region. But I'm not sure all of the descriptions that Dunn gives in the book really support this impression. For example, when Battuta was traveling through Tunisia, they were in the middle of a civil war. Chagatai collapsed months after Battuta left. The Ilkhanate had only nominal control over many of the Anatolian frontiers, and the Sultan of Delhi was a hot mess. The parties that Battuta traveled with were often beset by bandits or other misfortunes, including at one point when Battuta was robbed down to his underpants by pirates. It seems to me that Battuta was able to be so successful in his travels because the routes he took were so well worn. The Hajj caravans, traders, merchants by land and by sea, Sometimes it wasn't even Muslims he was traveling with. The boats he took from Anatolia to the Crimea were Italian merchants. So the image I think Battuta's travels leave us with is one of a highly interconnected world during a time period that we normally associate with being closed off and local, minus the occasional empire or crusade. When he finally returned to Tangiers and wrote about his experiences, Battuta called the book a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. Perhaps an exaltation that others might follow in his footsteps. And they certainly did. This kind of writing, a sort of Hajj travelogue, became an established genre in medieval Muslim scholarship, known as arihla. And I think our modern world is a lot closer to that of Battuta's than we would think hearing the phrase a traveler in the 14th century. And so, for those of you now who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling, a gift from Ibn Battuta and also Ross Dunn. So I hope you found this video interesting. I certainly enjoyed reading about it, so I hope you enjoyed hearing about the things that I read. If you think traveling is pretty neat, go ahead and give this video a like and do all of the other YouTube stuff. You know what that stuff is. And thank you for joining me on this journey. Have a good rest of your day. This was the expected mode of operation. Why didn't I say that in Latin? Why didn't I say that in Latin? Everyone talks. Ah.